This is Friday, June 2nd, and my lesson is entitled Abraham's Language. And in trying to trace this Hebrew as far back as I can to see if this is really the language that our forefathers were speaking. And I'm having a bit of trouble all the time because the Hebrew keeps showing up to not be the language. I'm going to read from this website because it gives kind of a summary of what I've been finding from a lot of people the more I keep reading. It's the website is from kubik.org. That's kubik.org. The article is entitled The Languages of the Bible by Mark D. Kaplan. Okay, look at what it's saying here now. It's talking about the three biblical languages. Okay, I'll start at the second paragraph. God's plan of salvation includes every human being regardless of language. The Bible has been preserved for us in three different languages, illustrating God's love for all people. Linguists have classified the world's languages in various families based on common characteristics. Two of the biblical languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, are in the Semitic family, which also includes Arabic and the ancient language of Akkadian. Now, I think recently I was saying, I'm starting to get the sense that some kind of African language. Now, it could also be Akkadian, and that might really be a contender as well. The language of Akkad. But now, where do you really find that language? That has died out, right? So what do you do? Anyway, it goes on. When used by linguists, the term Semitic refers to a family of related languages in Middle Eastern origin. The term is not used by linguists in a racial sense. The New Testament has been preserved in Greek, an Indo-European language which has had a major influence on our contemporary world. God's use of different languages in the Bible followed a pattern of focusing first on one region, then widening the scope of the message to include an empire, and finally including the entire known world between India and Ireland. Of course, in modern times, the Bible, through translation, has been accessible in almost every language known to human beings. Okay, now they're going to get into it. Most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, a dialect of Canaanite. Hear that? A dialect of Canaanite. That's one of the poems I've had. It would seem, if it's a dialect of Canaanite, it seems like it's something that's coming about later on. Nobody can, it seems, popularly show anything linking back to Adam. It's very difficult. Some people easily prove that it was Hebrew Adam was speaking. Some easily prove that it was Aramaic. But then there's still always so many kinds of questions. But dialect of Canaanite. Now, if you go with Canaanite here as meaning like the Canaanites and dealing with Ham, why is it that Israel should be speaking the language of the Hamites? See, that's always what gets me. The Canaanites were descendants of Ham. Biblical Hebrew and Biblical Aramaic are written with the same alphabet. So they say, okay, they just share the same script, the same alphabet. So they say, so it's not a problem, it was all Hebrew. That's what they're trying to let us think. But as I read on, you're going to see why I've been making these videos and trying to search. The most ancient Hebrew scriptures used the Canaanite style of forming the letters. Now, you have to understand that, because I used to see stuff like that a long time ago, and I would just be like, yeah, yeah. But now that I'm reading all these different stuff, the way I look at that sentence, again, it says the most ancient Hebrew scriptures use the Canaanite style of forming the letters. The more I look at that, is the more I'm seeing that it may have used the Canaanite style of forming the letters, but the most ancient Hebrew scriptures, that part is just the most ancient that is available to us. I find it a bit strange that so much happened before the Canaanites came along, before their land came along, and all that God did, that he was dealing with the people he was trying to set up from Adam coming on down to even Abraham here, and then to Moses, who the Torah is credited to in terms of writing it down. No one of them ever had any need to write down what the Most High said in the language they were speaking at the time when they got it from him, to the point where the whole world is wondering and arguing what language it was. Is it Hebrew? Is it something else? It just seems so convenient that the superpower empire that Israel was in and got delivered from Egypt, they are Hamites as well, just like the Canaanites. But in their empire, so many things in the Bible goes back to them. I mean, it seems Israel is formed as a nation coming out of Egypt. Where is some ancient source that shows the building up of this great people? You're telling me they never wrote anything at any point and left behind until they got into a Gentile empire, Egypt? Until there's big fight about, oh, you took your Hebrew Bible from, what do they call it, the Book of the Dead? Book of the Going Out and Coming In, or whatever they call it. So it seems like there's just this big fight with trying to get Egypt to either claim the Hebrew Bible as being its own, or just totally get rid of it because it's not true. It's the Egypt version that's true, the Book of the Dead. Everything seems to be pointing back to Egypt. But a great people who became great only because of great men before them, like Abraham and Adam. And if you don't think Adam is great, then why did the Creator give him such great responsibilities? But these people don't have any writings until a Gentile empire like Egypt comes up that was actually torturing them in slavery, till they had to cry out to the Creator. If you have to cry out to the Creator, no other living person is interested in helping you. It was bad in Egypt, when the only person who can hear you is God. And you're telling me the Canaanites come out of Ham, where the Egyptian empire is dealing with Ham, and somehow the Hebrews end up with a Canaanite dialect or a Canaanite language called Hebrew, and we're supposed to be satisfied with that? So if I go on here, most of the whole Old Testament written in a Hebrew, which is a dialect of Canaanite. The Canaanites were descendants of Ham. Biblical Hebrew and Biblical Aramaic are written with the same alphabet. The most ancient Hebrew scriptures use the Canaanite style of forming the letters. For about 24 centuries, the entire Old Testament has been preserved in the style of alphabet used anciently by Aramaic speakers. There are also some portions of the Old Testament written in the Aramaic language. The Arameans, or ancient Syrians, were descendants of Shem. The New Testament scriptures have been preserved for us in Greek. See, based on different things that I've read and heard the teachings of other people, I'm starting to think that this Abraham story is presented to us in a bit of a cover-up kind of way. that there was a history of the greatness of the people coming from Shem that was more than we're presented with, and that Abraham was only one of those people, but that they were greater than what is being presented to us. You see, just because the Most High is dealing with Abraham doesn't mean, quote unquote, Hebrews weren't populating all over the place. He was simply dealing with that man, Abraham. There are some portions written in the Aramaic language. The New Testament scriptures have been preserved for us in Greek. The Hebrew word for Greece is Javan. Contemporary Hebrew transliteration would spell it Yavan. The children of Javan trace their ancestry back to Japheth, 3 sons of Noah, the 3 patriarchs for the human race, 3 languages of the Bible, the written word which forms the basis of God's judgment on the whole of humanity. One of the earliest ancient cities was Akkad in Mesopotamia. See Genesis 10 verse 10. The ancient language of Mesopotamia, Akkadian, was similar to biblical Hebrew. So, okay, right away you can say, okay, they were probably speaking Akkadian then. Was similar to biblical Hebrew. Now, you see all these Aramaic, now Akkadian, Hebrew, they're telling you that tongues were split and everybody got different languages, but you're finding all these languages so similar. And then if you read somebody that tells you these were different languages that you couldn't necessarily understand properly, you might understand certain basic things, but you can't really. And so sometimes there's a back and forth, right? But perhaps Abraham originally spoke. Notice they're saying perhaps. And this is really what I'm finding a lot of people saying, perhaps, maybe, supposedly. Perhaps Abraham originally spoke an Akkadian dialect in Ur. So they don't really know what Abraham spoke. So how is it that we are sure that Abraham spoke Hebrew? When they say Abraham the Hebrew because he crossed over and so on, maybe you can accept that he spoke Hebrew at that point. But what was he speaking before that? He could really have been speaking Akkadian. He later migrated to... So then if he was speaking Akkadian, that means Hebrew was not his language. As they're telling you here, Akkadian was similar to biblical Hebrew. As far as I have found, no one quite knows what they call original Hebrew, what it really sounded like. So how do you know that it sounded like Akkadian? And do you know what the Akkadian really sounded like? You can see the scripts. You can see the scripts for these different languages, biblical Hebrew, Akkadian, Aramaic. But to see the way they wrote their letters, way they wrote their words, does that tell you just exactly how they sounded? Perhaps Abraham originally spoke an Akkadian dialect in Ur. He later migrated to a region which spoke a related language, Aramaic. So then, it would seem when you read the Bible that Abraham was speaking Aramaic originally. But here now they're telling you that maybe he spoke Akkadian. And then after migrating, he was speaking a related language, Aramaic. Related, so that means it's not this same language. So now he starts speaking Aramaic, so he is no longer speaking possibly Akkadian that he was speaking before. So another language comes in the picture here, Aramaic, but when you read the Bible, it makes it sound like Aramaic was what he was speaking at first. Anyway, Aram was a descendant of Shem in Genesis 10:22. The name of Aram became identified with the region later known as Syria. When Abraham went south to Canaan, the relatives that he left behind continued to speak Aramaic. So he left them with Aramaic back home where he was coming from. The Canaanites were descendants of Ham, Genesis 10:6. In Canaan, Abraham, listen to this, picked up the local language. So he was speaking Aramaic, and he left his people with Aramaic back then in his hometown, and picked up the local language of Canaan. His clans, that means Abraham's clans version of Canaanite, became known as Hebrew. But listen to this, people. When you read all this kind of stuff, they'll tell you, as this person already said too, that Hebrew is a Canaanite tongue. It's a dialect of Canaan. And Abraham did not have Hebrew before he got to Canaan. So if they're telling you his clan's version of Canaanite became known as Hebrew, they should have told you his version, Abraham's version, what he was speaking, became known as something else because he wasn't speaking the Canaanite Hebrew that he found there when he got there as perfectly or as well as the Canaanites were speaking Hebrew, were speaking their language, their Hebrew. So they should have more said his version became known as some broken Hebrew or some other kind of Hebrew, like some Aramaic Hebrew or some Arabru or something like that. How can his version become known as Hebrew when the people in Canaan where he went to were already speaking Hebrew, and he picked up the local Hebrew language when he got there because he was speaking Aramaic before, a different language? Because you see, what they're doing here is by saying his version became known as Hebrew, they're making it sound as if Hebrew language started with Abraham, or it's unique to Abraham, but it was already being spoken by the Canaanites. So it should more be saying something like he started to speak their language, Hebrew, and he left off from his Aramaic. So if he was possibly speaking Akkadian at first, but certainly was speaking Aramaic at some point, and then after his travels he went to Canaan and took up the local language which became known as Hebrew in his clan, he's basically then saying to his people, everybody around him, yeah, we speak Hebrew now that we're here, the same language as the Canaanites that we are now among. We're speaking the language of the land that we just moved to. That's what it really is. Hebrew is what he found when he got there to Canaan. So Abraham the Hebrew, calling him Abraham the Hebrew, sounds like a trick sentence to me, a trick name, or a trick title. Because if in Canaan Hebrew was already being spoken, how can they in Canaan look at him and call him Abraham the Hebrew when Hebrew is common to them all? It's like if you come to America and Americans are speaking English all along, and you just move to America and you start to speak English where you were speaking something else before, wherever you're coming from, somebody's going to call you Billy the English, as if nobody else is speaking English, but English is so unique to you. And when they heard it, they're like, man, that's different. What's he speaking? Oh, he said he's speaking English. Oh, now everybody wants to learn your English. No. Billy came and learned English from the Americans. So it's nothing special about Billy, as if he can be solely identified as the only person speaking English. So Abraham the Hebrew sounds strange when Hebrew was already a dialect of Canaan. He got into Canaan and heard the dialect of Hebrew being used, a dialect of Canaan being used called Hebrew, and he picked up that local Hebrew and started speaking it there, because he was speaking Aramaic before. So Hebrew is not unique to Abraham. And then the trick of the mind to get us to accept that it was Hebrew is to tell us, is to give us a double meaning, because they like to give us a lot of double meanings by tying in the Bible with some obscure history or fake history. And they will tell you he was speaking Hebrew as a language, but then they'll tell you that they're calling him Abraham the Hebrew because he was speaking Hebrew. But to make sure that you don't dwell on that alone, because you might find a problem with it, then they give you a double answer as well and say he was called Abraham the Hebrew because he crossed over, and Hebrew means one who was crossed over. So you can't fully throw out the Hebrew part, Abraham the Hebrew, because you're going to get rid of him crossing over. And the fact is that he really did cross over, physically cross the Euphrates, but physically, literally in his life, spiritually as well, he actually crossed over from pagan worshiping the gods of his fathers and so on. So it's kind of hard for you to throw out the Hebrew. So they make the Hebrew language stick by giving you another part, another important thing in his life that he actually crossed over. That way you will always mention Hebrew with Abraham, because if you don't like it that he supposedly spoke Hebrew and you want to get rid of that language from sticking to Abraham, you can't quite get rid of the word Hebrew when you mention his name, because he actually did cross over. And so, you see the mental trickery with it. Get Hebrew to stick with Abraham no matter what you do. Tell them he crossed over, so they'll keep Hebrew linked to his name. Let me see if I need any more. The lip of Canaan. The Canaanite dialect spoken by the Hebrews is called the Hebrew language. Isaiah 19:18. It is called literally the lip of Canaan. Again, the lip of Canaan. So the dialect of Canaan spoken by the Hebrews is called the Hebrew language. And now they say in modern times, they woke up the Hebrew now, but now they just put vowel pointings with it, all the little fancy stuff. Hebrew, they're saying it's the same Hebrew today, it's just that it's modernized, so slight changes, whatever, but it's really the language. It looks to me, I've been doing this, I'm a novice with this kind of history, because I've told you in a number of recordings ago, I was never studious with these things to begin with, and I don't know a lot of geography and so on. I'm learning slowly as I go, because these things are making me read and study. But it seems to me that Abraham was not speaking Hebrew, but he began to speak Hebrew at a certain point. And they're trying to sell us that Hebrew, which is a Canaanite language, because they are giving us a Canaanite Torah scroll and telling you the Hebrew in it is from Canaan, is from the Hebrews. When they're giving us a set of scrolls to use in our Strong's Concordance and our lexicons and so on, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're giving us something that is from the Canaanites, the evil Canaanites, that the Most High said destroy. But they weren't all destroyed, we know. They stuck around to take Israel down. That's fact. That's history. Why is the people going to give you their gods and you're already speaking their language? They do something to you spiritually, but they don't do anything to your scrolls, to your books, to your writings, to your history. Now, there's more on this page that I'd like to read, but I'll pause it there. I'll stop it there to just mention something else. Now, I can't remember this, brother, but I found a video months ago, and I've been trying to find it again. I don't know. I have it backed up on my computer, but it's been so long I can't find it. I don't know the name of it anymore, of his video, so I can't even look it up online. I don't know his name. It's the first time I came across him, but it looks like he's a brother from Ghana. So, and he was mentioning something. I think maybe he had the stories in the Bible and the dating mixed up, but his point still made sense. Because it seems to me, I think he was kind of mixing up the Tower of Babel dating and Abraham. But anyway, the gist of what he was saying led me to think this. is that in ancient times, people were not necessarily known by the language that they spoke. They weren't named like that. Like the French speak French, so you call them the French. English speak English, so you call. You know, you might call a person Spanish and you expect that they speak Spanish, but it wasn't like that in ancient times. Long ago, people were more identified by the land that they lived in. And so their land, like their land or their tribe, something very, very, something connected to land. Land is a big thing. Even today, they're taking over lands all the time, and, So it was by their land. So if Abraham is getting a fresh new start in life, having put away the gods of his fathers now and so on, and he's coming now, and Abraham settles in Hebron, then he would more have been known not as Abraham the Hebrew, because Hebrew is not unique to Abraham. He found it there in Canaan when he got there. So how can you call him Abraham the Hebrew? You should have more seen in the Bible Abraham the Hebron, because Abraham was in Hebron. And since people were referenced by their land, and then their land lets you know all kinds of other information about them, like it would let you know their culture, it would let you know the gods that they worshipped and so on, possibly the kind of foods that they would eat. So by the land, then if he's in Hebron, he would have been called Abraham the Hebron. But you see the trick now of how close Hebron and Hebrew is in the way that they sound, like phonetically, it sounds close. Hebron, Hebrew, and then they get the whole Habiru thing, but Hebron, Hebrew. So instead of telling you it's Abraham the Hebron, to let you know where he settled at, they're telling you he's Abraham the Hebrew. So if this was Abraham the Hebron, because, you always hear of these people, the Canaanite this and the Canaanite that. Well, why wouldn't they have talked about the Hebron Abraham or Abraham the Hebron? Look at Hagar the Egyptian. They didn't say, because Egypt spoke Coptic, they didn't say Hagar the Coptic and name her by her language. So why are they naming Abraham by his language, which is a language you picked up later on, Hebrew of the Canaanites? Why are they naming him by his language, saying Abraham the Hebrew? Just like they named her Hagar the Egyptian instead of the Coptic, he would have been more called Abraham the Hebron. She was called after her land, Egypt, Hagar the Egyptian. Well, he would have been called by the land he had settled in with his new beginning with the Most High, and so be known as Abraham the Hebron, and that's how it should have been written in the Bible, I would think. Then you hear the case of like Uriah the Hittite, because they call people by the lands. So Abraham the Hebrew seems very strange to me, like somebody's trying to convince the modern world and convince us, the Israelites lost in captivity, that he was speaking Hebrew originally, or like Hebrew started with him. When Hebrew was there before, he found it, he picked it up, he started speaking it, and we're still guessing what language he was speaking originally. But it seems it could have been Akkadian, like they're saying here, which I found that elsewhere as well too. But who knows? Who knows? What if it was something else? Nobody quite seems to know. It's like it's very, very. Every time somebody says this or that, somebody else has another objection or a question that really challenges it. Because I'm telling you, I've seen all kinds of different stuff, and I'm going to throw some more. But to close it here, it would more make sense to me that he was called Abraham the Hebron and not Abraham the Hebrew. Just like you got Uriah the Hittite, telling you like the people in the land that he would have more been connected to, or Hagar the Egyptian, talking about the people of the land. You get what I'm trying to say. Abraham the Hebron.